Imagine walking down a dark street at night and suddenly confronting a question that has haunted humanity for centuries. What makes a person commit a crime? Is it poverty? Is it pure evil? Is it a choice they consciously make? Or is it something buried so deeply in their unconscious mind that they themselves don't fully understand why they do it? Today, we're going to explore one of the most profound and controversial theories about criminal behavior, one that revolutionized how we think about psychology, guilt, and the human mind: Sigmund Freud's groundbreaking theory of criminal behavior. By the end of this video, you'll understand why a seemingly normal person might steal, harm others, or engage in destructive behavior, and you'll see the world through the lens of one of history's most influential but misunderstood psychological frameworks. So stay with me as we dive deep into the unconscious forces that drive criminal actions. Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, didn't originally set out to explain criminal behavior, but rather he was attempting to understand the fundamental structure of the human mind. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Freud proposed a radical idea that human behavior isn't solely controlled by conscious thought and rational decision-making, but rather by powerful unconscious forces lurking beneath the surface of our awareness. These unconscious forces, Freud argued, shape everything we do, including whether we become criminals or law-abiding citizens. Freud's theory of criminal behavior emerges from his broader psychological framework, which includes his famous model of the mind divided into three parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id, according to Freud, is the most primitive part of our personality, the seat of our deepest desires, our wants for gratification, and our basic instincts. The ego is the rational, conscious part that mediates between our desires and the external world. The superego is our moral conscience, the internalized voice of society and our parents that tells us right from wrong. In a psychologically healthy person, these three parts work in harmony. But in a criminal, Freud suggested, something has gone profoundly wrong with this balance. Understanding this imbalance is the key to understanding criminal behavior itself, because Freud believed that criminals aren't simply evil people who choose to break the law. Instead, they are individuals whose psychological development has been disrupted, whose unconscious drives have overwhelmed their rational control, or whose moral conscience has failed to develop properly. Let's begin by understanding the id, because the id is where criminal impulses originate. The id is what Freud called the pleasure principle in action. It seeks immediate gratification without regard for consequences, morality, or the needs of others. Imagine a young child who sees a toy and wants it immediately. If no one stops them, they will simply take it without understanding concepts like ownership or theft. This is the id in pure form. In a healthy psychological development, the ego and superego mature and learn to control these impulses, channeling them into socially acceptable behaviors. However, according to Freud, some individuals never adequately develop these controlling mechanisms, and their id remains dominant throughout their lives. Consider the case of a person who commits robbery. On the surface, we might think they are rational criminals, calculating profit and risk, but Freud would argue that what's actually happening is that their id, their primitive desire for money, status, and the immediate gratification these things represent, has broken through the weakened defenses of their ego. The criminal acts impulsively, without properly considering the consequences, driven by unconscious desires that feel more real and urgent to them than the rational calculations of profit and loss. Another example is sexual crimes. Freud believed that sexual instincts, rooted in the id and driven by what he called the libido, are among the most powerful forces in the human psyche. When a person commits a sexual crime, Freud would suggest that their repressed sexual desires they may not even consciously acknowledge, have erupted from the unconscious in a destructive and harmful way. The id doesn't distinguish between socially appropriate and inappropriate expressions of these desires. It simply wants gratification, and if the superego is weak or absent, nothing prevents this gratification from manifesting as criminal behavior. This is why Freud believed that understanding the criminal act requires us to look beneath the surface behavior and ask, what unconscious desire is driving this action? What primitive impulse is trying to satisfy itself through this crime? But the id alone doesn't explain criminal behavior, because many people have strong primitive desires yet never commit crimes. The real key to Freud's theory lies in the superego, or more specifically, in the failure of the superego to develop properly. The superego is built through our interactions with our parents and our broader society during childhood. When parents effectively teach their children right from wrong, when they provide consistent discipline and love, the child internalizes these moral principles and develops a healthy superego. This superego then serves as an internal policeman, making us feel guilty when we contemplate wrongdoing and proud when we act morally. However, according to Freud, some individuals never develop an adequate superego. This can happen for several reasons. First, there may be inadequate parental guidance or discipline. If a child's parents are absent, neglectful, or inconsistent, the child never learns to internalize moral principles, and they grow up without a properly functioning conscience. Such individuals may commit crimes without feeling appropriate guilt because their superego simply isn't strong enough to restrain their id. Second, the relationship between a child and their parents might be so damaged that the child actively rejects parental values as a form of rebellion. Consider a child who has been severely abused by a parent. This child might unconsciously reject the parent's moral teachings as a way of rejecting the abusive parent themselves. In adulthood, this person becomes a criminal not because they lack a superego, but because their superego is twisted and hostile, motivated by unconscious resentment rather than healthy moral development. Third, Freud noted that some people develop what he called a weak superego that fails under stress or temptation. These individuals know right from wrong intellectually, but their superego lacks the emotional force to prevent them from acting on their id's demands when they are hungry, desperate, or emotionally overwhelmed. This might explain the seemingly respectable person who suddenly commits a crime during a moment of extreme stress or passion. A classic example from criminal psychology would be a person who embezzles money from their employer. On the surface, this might seem like a rational crime. The person needs money and sees an opportunity. But Freud would argue that what's actually happening is that their id, their primitive desire for money, status, and the immediate gratification these things represent, has broken through the weakened defenses of their ego. The criminal acts impulsively, without properly considering the consequences, driven by unconscious desires that feel more real and urgent to them than the rational calculations of profit and loss. Another crucial element of Freud's theory involves defense mechanisms, the psychological processes by which the ego protects itself from anxiety and the demands of the id. Freud identified numerous defense mechanisms: repression, projection, rationalization, displacement, and others, and he believed that criminals often rely heavily on defense mechanisms to commit crimes while maintaining a sense of psychological integrity. For instance, rationalization is a defense mechanism by which people unconsciously convince themselves that their behavior is justified. A person who commits assault might rationalize their violence by convincing themselves that the victim deserved it, that they were acting in self-defense, or that they were teaching someone a lesson. None of these thoughts are fully conscious. They emerge from the unconscious as a way of allowing the ego to permit the id's aggressive impulses while avoiding the crushing guilt that a healthy superego would impose. Projection is another defense mechanism relevant to criminal behavior. Through projection, a person attributes their own unacceptable desires to others. A person with strong, repressed aggressive impulses, for example, might become convinced that others are aggressive towards them, and this false belief might justify their own aggressive or violent response. In extreme cases, projection can fuel violence motivated by paranoia or perceived threats that exist primarily in the person's unconscious mind. Displacement is the mechanism by which a person redirects an emotional impulse from its true target to a safer target. A person who is unconsciously angry at their father, for instance, might displace that anger onto society, authority figures, or vulnerable groups, committing crimes as a twisted expression of this misdirected rage. These defense mechanisms are important because they show that criminal behavior isn't always about wanting to harm others. It's often about the ego's desperate attempt to manage the conflicting demands of the id, the superego, and reality. Freud placed tremendous emphasis on the Oedipus complex as a crucial stage in psychological development, and he believed it was directly relevant to understanding criminal behavior. According to Freud, during childhood, every child develops unconscious sexual and aggressive desires to the opposite sex parent and hostile feelings towards the same-sex parent. In healthy development, the child eventually identifies with the same-sex parent, internalizes their values, and redirects their desires into socially appropriate channels. However, if this process is disrupted, if a child never adequately identifies with the parent of the same sex, or if the parent-child relationship is traumatic, the result can be serious psychological problems, including criminal behavior. Freud argued that some criminals are actually acting out unresolved Oedipus conflicts through their crimes. For example, a man who murdered authority figures might be unconsciously acting out his repressed desire to harm his father. A woman who seduces or betrays others might be unconsciously psychological problems, including criminal behavior. Freud argued that some criminals are actually acting out unresolved Oedipal conflicts through their crimes. For example, a man who murdered authority figures might be unconsciously acting out his repressed desire to harm his father. A woman who seduces or betrays others might be unconsciously acting out revenge against her mother or seeking the approval of a distant father. These are not conscious motivations, but unconscious reenactments of childhood conflicts. More importantly, Freud believed that a properly resolved Oedipus complex leads to the internalization of the same-sex parent's moral values, creating a strong superego. If the complex is unresolved, the superego remains weak, and the person is vulnerable to criminal behavior. Additionally, Freud observed that some people become criminals not despite guilt, but because of it. He described a phenomenon he called criminals from guilt, people who unconsciously desire punishment because they harbor deep-seated guilt from childhood conflicts or past wrongdoings. These individuals commit crimes partly because they need to be caught and punished. The crime and punishment represent an unconscious way of expiating guilt and achieving psychological relief. This is a paradoxical but important aspect of Freud's theory. Sometimes criminality itself is a symptom of a guilty conscience rather than a sign of moral indifference. Central to Freud's understanding of criminal behavior is the concept of repression, the unconscious burying of unacceptable thoughts, desires, and memories. Freud believed that from early childhood, people unconsciously repress desires and experiences that conflict with their sense of self or their superego. These repressed contents don't disappear. They remain active in the unconscious, constantly pushing for expression. The criminal act, in this framework, often represents the return of the repressed, a moment when repressed desires or memories break through the ego's defenses and find expression in behavior, often in distorted or displaced forms. Consider someone who was sexually abused as a child, but who repressed the memory and the trauma associated with it. This person might, years later, unconsciously commit a sexual crime, reenacting the trauma they experienced or attempting to gain mastery over it through becoming the perpetrator rather than the victim. Or consider a person who harbors unconscious rage at a parent or authority figure. This rage is repressed because it would create unbearable anxiety and guilt if it became conscious. Years later, this repressed rage might erupt as violence against a symbolic representative of that parent or authority figure. The person may not understand why they acted so violently. They may not even recognize the connection between their current behavior and their childhood experience. But Freud would argue that the unconscious connection is real and that understanding the repressed trauma is essential to understanding the criminal act. This aspect of Freud's theory has profound implications because it suggests that criminals are often victims as much as perpetrators, people whose own psychological trauma has found expression in harmful behavior. To make Freud's theory more concrete, let's examine how it might apply to different types of criminals. Consider a violent offender, a person who commits assault or murder. According to Freud, this person likely has a weak superego that cannot contain their aggressive id impulses. These aggressive impulses might stem from early childhood experiences. Perhaps the person was abused or witnessed violence in their family. The trauma wasn't processed psychologically. Instead, it was repressed and has remained active in the unconscious, constantly seeking expression. When the person encounters a situation that triggers this repressed trauma, perhaps someone who reminds them of their abuser, or a situation that mirrors the original trauma, the repressed aggression breaks through and the person commits violence. The violence itself might seem disproportionate to the immediate trigger because its true source is the deep unconscious rage accumulated over years. Now consider a white-collar criminal, someone who commits fraud or embezzlement. Freud might explain this differently. This person likely has a superego that is intact but has become corrupted through various rationalizations and defense mechanisms. Perhaps the person feels cheated by society, undervalued, or entitled to more than they have received. These feelings create unconscious resentment that they cannot directly acknowledge. Through rationalization and other defense mechanisms, their superego permits their id to seek gratification through theft or fraud. The person might not even experience strong guilt because their ego has successfully convinced them that their actions are justified. Next, consider a sexual offender. Freud would focus on repressed sexual desires and unresolved conflicts from the Oedipal period or earlier. The person may have experienced sexual confusion, trauma, or inappropriate sexual exposure during childhood. These experiences were repressed, but the sexual impulses they created remained active in the unconscious. The person then develops sexual perversions or desires that are socially unacceptable, but they cannot consciously acknowledge these desires because doing so would create unbearable shame and anxiety. Eventually, the repressed sexual impulse breaks through and the person commits a sexual crime. The specific crime might reflect the specific nature of their repressed desires and trauma. Finally, consider a serial criminal, someone who commits repeated crimes. Freud might explain this as a person with such a weak or absent superego that no internal moral restraint prevents them from acting on their desires. Alternatively, it might reflect the criminal from guilt phenomenon, where the person unconsciously craves the punishment that comes from criminal behavior as a way of managing deep-seated guilt from childhood conflicts or past wrongdoings. These individuals commit crimes partly because they need to be caught and punished. The crime and punishment represent an unconscious way of expiating guilt and achieving psychological relief. It's important to acknowledge that Freud's theory of criminal behavior, while influential, has significant limitations and has faced substantial criticism from modern psychology and criminology. First, Freud's theories are difficult to test empirically because they rely on unconscious processes that cannot be directly observed or measured. Modern psychology has moved toward evidence-based approaches that can be rigorously tested. Second, Freud's theory can be overly deterministic, suggesting that childhood experiences inevitably determine adult criminal behavior. This overlooks the complexity of human behavior and the role of conscious choice, social factors, and situational influences. Third, Freud's theory has been criticized for lacking cultural sensitivity and for imposing a particular view of normal development that may not apply across all cultures and contexts. Fourth, some critics argue that Freud's concepts, like the Oedipus complex, are not universal and may reflect particular historical and cultural circumstances rather than fundamental aspects of human psychology. Despite these limitations, Freud's theory remains important because it highlighted the role of unconscious processes in behavior and emphasized the importance of early childhood experiences in shaping personality and behavioral tendencies. Modern criminology often incorporates insights from Freud's work, even while using more rigorous methodologies. So, what does Freud's theory of criminal behavior tell us ultimately? It tells us that criminals are not simply evil people who choose to break the law, but rather individuals whose psychological development has been disrupted, whose unconscious forces have overwhelmed their rational control, and whose moral conscience has failed to develop adequately. Understanding criminal behavior through this lens requires us to look beyond the surface of the crime itself and ask deeper questions about the person's childhood, their family relationships, their repressed traumas, and the unconscious conflicts driving their behavior. This doesn't excuse criminal behavior. Accountability and justice remain essential, but it provides a more compassionate and psychologically sophisticated understanding of why people commit crimes. When we truly understand the roots of criminal behavior, we gain the possibility of prevention and rehabilitation, moving beyond mere punishment toward genuine healing and transformation. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the human mind.